everybody. We are about to begin our final topic of the semester. So last time we talked about tissues and tissues being groups of specialized cells. The next level up in our organization scheme are organ systems. And again, that's primarily covered in 201 and 202, Anatomy and Physiology. We're going to talk a little bit about one organ system, the endocrine system, and how it functions as kind of an example of an organ system. And if you're taking 201 and 202, you'll learn about all the rest of them there. So we're going to talk about the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is a series of glands, which are called endocrine glands. And endocrine glands produce hormones. And hormones are released into the blood and travel in the blood to a target tissue. So the endocrine system is actually kind of a way that the body uses to communicate so that a product produced by one gland can influence something happening at a distant gland. So an example of an endocrine gland is the pancreas, which makes insulin. So the pancreas makes insulin, releases it into the blood, it goes to its target tissues and causes glucose to be taken up there. So that's just one example. There are many other endocrine glands and hormones, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So a hormone is a chemical compound produced by the gland, released into the blood, has specific target tissues, and we'll be talking about a number of them, not everyone. This gives you a list of all the different endocrine glands in your body. This is a list here. I'm going to go to the next page, which has a picture of them, and use that to talk about it. So we're not going to talk about every one of these endocrine glands, but the first endocrine gland that I'll mention is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is kind of at the base of your brain. It's just a little tiny bulb hanging down from your brain. And it's directly connected to a region of your brain called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is is an area of your brain involved in basic body regulation, things like maintaining hunger, temperature regulation, water intake. Those are some basic activities that are necessary for sustaining life that are regulated by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus interacts with the endocrine system directly through the pituitary gland and then through some other mechanisms also. So we're going to talk about the pituitary gland, makes lots of hormones. We'll talk about the thyroid gland, which is in your neck, right here. We're not going to, there's a little bit of hormones made in the heart. We're not going to talk about them. We'll talk about your pancreas, which is kind of lays on top of your stomach here. So this is your stomach. The pancreas is kind of the yellow thing. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about the adrenal glands. And you have two adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidney. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the reproductive hormones that are produced in the testes and the ovaries. So that'll probably be on the next PowerPoint that we'll do the reproductive hormones. But today we'll do the pituitary gland, thyroid, pancreas, and adrenal gland and what hormones they make and function is. So a hormone is a chemical. It's released into the blood by exocytosis. We talked about that a little bit. There are kind of two broad categories for hormones. Some hormones are lipids, and they're primarily made from cholesterol. So, for example, things that have like a sterone name in them. So, testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, cortisone. Those are all lipid hormones that are made from cholesterol. Then some hormones are peptides. So they're either proteins or one or two amino acids or small proteins. So that's why they're called peptides, because they're not all big proteins. They would include things like epinephrine, insulin. I'm trying to think of something else that you might be familiar with, but we'll be talking about some of them. So they're produced in a gland, the hormones, both lipid and peptide. They're released into the blood, and then they travel throughout the blood to what's considered to be a target tissue. And something is, before I do that, this is just an example of some of the proteins. This one is insulin here. So it's a protein. Each one of these represents an amino acid. I think insulin, I don't want to count them, but I think it has about 31 amino acids. It's made in the pancreas. This is another peptide hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin, we'll talk about, is a small peptide. It only has 9 amino acids. It's made in the pituitary gland. These are the two forms of thyroid hormone. They are also made from amino acids. And then testosterone is a lipid. It's an example of one of the hormones that are made from lipids. So when the hormone is released in the blood, so this would be, excuse me, the gland here, and it's making the hormone. So the hormone would be these little blue circles, and they're made in the gland. They're released from the gland by exocytosis. They go into the blood, and this red thing is supposed to be an artery. They travel in the blood, and when they reach their target tissue, they attach to a receptor on the target cell and then cause something to happen inside the target cell. So when you release something into your blood, you can't give it directions and say, okay, your target cell is the kidney, so you go to the kidney, your blood goes everywhere. But what happens is only the cells, for example, in the kidney would have a receptor for that hormone for it to attach. Other tissues might not have a receptor, so that hormone would not attach to those cells and cause anything to happen in them. So it's the presence of a receptor on the target cell that enables it to respond to the hormone. If it doesn't have a receptor, then it can't be a target cell because the hormone cannot attach to it and cause something to happen. So that's the basic way that hormones are involved in communication, because it's something made in one part of your body causing something to happen in a distant part of your body. And so that's why it is communication type effect. Excuse me. And this is just another picture. So here is the pancreas, and it's making insulin. And the insulin are the little blue dots going into the blood and going to a target tissues. One of the target tissues for insulin is the liver. So it would attach to a receptor in the liver and cause glucose to be taken up by the liver. This is just also showing the pituitary gland. We won't talk about that right now. But we are going to talk in more detail about a number of different endocrine glands. The first one we're going to talk about is the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, excuse me, is the one that is at the base of your brain. It's actually attached to the brain, and it's directly controlled by the hypothalamus. So one of the major things that the pituitary gland does is that it actually controls other endocrine glands. So by releasing certain hormones, it's able to control the activity of another endocrine gland. For example, we'll talk about that with thyroid gland. The pituitary actually can stimulate the thyroid gland. Hormones are usually controlled by what's called negative feedback. We've talked about that with enzymes. Negative feedback is when the result shuts off the process. And we'll give you some examples of that as we go through to illustrate what negative feedback examples are. Just to give you an example of how the pituitary is involved in controlling other glands. And because of that control, the pituitary is considered to be the master gland. So the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary. So if you need more thyroid hormone, the hypothalamus sends a product to the pituitary, and that stimulates the pituitary to make a hormone that goes to the thyroid and causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. The negative feedback is that then they will go back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus and say, we got our thyroid hormone, you don't need to stimulate the thyroid anymore to make more. Okay, so the pituitary is a little complicated because it makes so many different hormones. It's actually divided into two different parts, even though it's this really tiny gland. The one part is called the posterior pituitary. Oops, I thought I changed to erase that. The posterior pituitary means it's kind of the back part of the pituitary. And the posterior pituitary only makes two hormones. And one of them is called antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, as the name implies, a diuretic, some of you may know because you may take, or you may know somebody who takes a diuretic increases urine output. So an antidiuretic hormone decreases urine output. And its major target is the kidney, which controls the amount of water that's excreted in your urine. So say, for example, you're dehydrated. Your pituitary gland would release antidiuretic hormone, which would go to the kidney and decrease water loss in the urine. Obviously, there's a limit as to how much it can do that, but that helps conserve water and if you're dehydrated. Likewise, if your blood pressure drops, it will be released from the pituitary, go to the kidney, cause water to be conserved, and that would increase your blood volume and increase your blood pressure. So that's one hormone produced by the posterior pituitary. The other hormone is oxytocin, which actually is very similar chemically. They're both 9 amino acids. It's just 2 of them are different in oxytocin from antidiuretic hormone. And oxytocin stimulates the uterus, contraction of muscles in the uterus, and that's important during delivery of a baby. You may have heard of women or experienced it, of getting Pitocin, which is a synthetic form of oxytocin, if labor is proceeding slowly, and that will increase the rate of contractions. Oxytocin also functions in mammary glands for milk ejection during nursing. So that's the two hormones of the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes a lot of hormones. And some of those are called tropic hormones. And tropic means it stimulates something else. And so for those, we're going to actually talk about them when we get to the target tissue. So one of the tropic hormones is thyroid stimulating hormone. So thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropin hormone, that's a really big word, that's why we call it ACTH, stimulates the adrenal gland to make hormones. Gonadotropic, they all have this tropic in them. Hormones stimulate the testes and the ovary to make reproductive hormones and sex-related hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. So those three we're going to talk about when we get to the adrenal gland, the thyroid gland, and the reproductive glands. The other two hormones made by the anterior pituitary, one is prolactin, which I'll just mention briefly. Prolactin also stimulates the mammary gland, but prolactin stimulates milk production. Whereas oxytocin over here stimulates milk release. So this causes milk to be produced in the mammary gland. This causes it to be ejected during nursing. So they both work on the mammary gland, but have different functions. The other one is growth hormone, and as you might guess by the name, growth hormone is involved in regulating growth, primarily controlling long bone growth, which would be like the bones of your arms and your legs, and muscle development. So some disorders of growth are associated with inappropriate growth hormone production, either too much or too little. And that can do, if you have too much growth hormone, that can lead to gigantism, as illustrated here. And excuse me, too little growth hormone can lead to pituitary dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is just one type of dwarfism. There are some other types of dwarfism that aren't related to growth hormone. But pituitary dwarfism, this is a woman who was on American Horror Story, if you ever watched that, but she was in American Horror Story Freak Show. But I think she was born in like 1990 something. So she's close to 30 years of age. This is the Guinness Book of World. She's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the world's smallest person. So you can see, I think she's only 20 some inches tall. And then I'm not sure, I think he's about 8 feet tall, but I'm not sure. But anyway, currently, growth hormone can be produced through DNA technology. And so it's available to treat dwarfism due to lack of growth hormone. And so it can be administered if children are diagnosed to have inappropriate levels of dwarfism. Inappropriate levels of growth hormone causing dwarfism. And that can correct the growth abnormality. Excuse me. So the thyroid gland is in your neck. It is like an H-shaped over your larynx. You can't really feel it, but it's right there. And it's released, thyroid hormone is released in conditions of temperature regulation, stress, where you need to increase your rate of metabolism. So if you're exposed to long-term cold, not so much if you just go out and the air conditioner is too low for a few seconds, but it's more like long-term kind of stress situations. So if the temperature is low and you're in cold temperatures, that's detected by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends a releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which releases something called thyroid stimulating hormone, which goes to the thyroid gland and causes it to release thyroid hormone. Thyroxine is another name for thyroid hormone. And that's going to initiate a series of changes inside of cells to increase metabolic rate, which is going to increase heat production in response to the cold. So this series of steps are how thyroid gland is controlled. It's controlled ultimately by the hypothalamus through the anterior pituitary, stimulating the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. And so if you have too much thyroid hormone, your metabolic rate can be too high. If you have too little, your metabolic rate can be too low. So there are conditions associated both with excessive production of thyroid hormone and inadequate production of thyroid hormone. And once the thyroid hormone is released, causes body temperature to return to normal. That's going to be detected by the hypothalamus that says, okay, we don't need any more thyroid hormone. So it's going to decrease stimulation of the pituitary, which will decrease stimulation of the thyroid gland, which will decrease production of thyroid hormone. So that's the negative feedback part, that once you start making thyroid hormone and it starts functioning, then you shut off making any more because you don't want it to be overactive and increase body temperature too much. One of the interesting things about thyroid gland is that part of its structure contains the element iodine. It's really the only place in the body that iodine is known to have any physiological properties. And so when you stimulate your thyroid gland to make thyroid hormone, it needs to have iodine there to be able to make thyroid hormone. So if you don't have sufficient iodine available, then their thyroid gland is never able to produce the thyroid hormone. So you're never able to do the negative feedback and shut off the production of thyroid hormone. So the hypothalamus keeps stimulating the thyroid gland, and it causes to enlargement of the thyroid gland, which is shown here. That's called leads to a condition called goiter. And one of the causes of goiter can be inadequate dietary iodine. Iodine is one of those things that is not really from certain iodine-rich foods, but it more is dependent of the soil that the food is grown in, because it's a mineral in the soil. And in this country, starting in the 1920s, they started iodizing salt as a way of getting adequate iodine intake. And you may have noticed in the grocery store, there's containers of salt when you buy them can be either iodized or not iodized. And so the iodized salt provides iodine to prevent iodine deficiency if you use that as your salt. While we're around the thyroid gland actually produces a second hormone that is involved in regulation of blood calcium levels. And blood calcium levels are very tightly regulated. So there's little change in your blood calcium level. Even if you just drank a gallon of milk with a lot of calcium, or if you haven't drank or consumed any foods with calcium, your blood calcium level stays pretty constant. And the reason that's important is that calcium ions from your blood are important in controlling muscle contraction. And the heart is a muscle. And so in order to get normal contraction of your heart muscle, you need to have appropriate levels of calcium in your blood. So that's very tightly monitored by the body. And as soon as blood calcium levels would begin to drop, so if you have low blood calcium level, a hormone called parathyroid hormone is released from these little glands that usually you have 4 of them. They're called parathyroid. Para means around, and they're small glands that are attached to the thyroid gland, and they actually produce parathyroid hormone. And so if your blood calcium level is low, your parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, and it increases calcium retention by the kidneys, calcium absorption from food, and will actually cause your bone mineral to break down to replace calcium in your blood. In terms of survival, having normal blood calcium is more important than having strong bones. Then when your blood calcium level returns back to normal, that mechanism is shut off and the blood parathyroid hormone level goes back to normal. If on the other condition, your blood calcium level increases and is too high, a different hormone is released, and this one is made also in the thyroid gland, called calcitonin. And calcitonin kind of does the opposite of parathyroid hormone. It causes calcium to be excreted in the urine. It causes it to be taken up into bone. And so it lowers blood calcium levels and returns them back to normal. So those 2 hormones, calcitonin if blood calcium is too high, or parathyroid hormone if blood calcium is too low, work together to keep your blood calcium levels normal. This is pretty much the same thing. I just went through that. A similar type mechanism occurs for regulating blood glucose levels, and most people have heard of this mechanism. So you have two hormones that work together to keep your blood glucose level in the range of about 80 to 100 milligrams. And so if your blood glucose level increases because you ate a lot of glucose containing foods and your blood glucose levels increase, and that usually occurs within 2 hours after eating, sometimes even faster if they were just sugary foods, that causes the pancreas to release insulin. And insulin will cause blood glucose levels to drop. If you haven't eaten for a while, I'm going to go to the next slide. So if your blood glucose goes up because you've just eaten foods containing glucose, the pancreas secretes insulin, and that causes glucose to enter into the liver, to your muscle cells, and to fat cells. So that removes glucose from the blood into those three tissues. That lowers your blood glucose back to normal, and then that is going to shut off any more insulin because you wouldn't want your blood glucose levels to go too low. If, on the other hand, your blood glucose levels start to drop, and this happens daily throughout the day, so like if you have a meal, and like the 2 hours after your meal, your glucose is going to be increasing, that glucose is going to be cleared by the insulin, and then your blood glucose is going to go back to normal. But then if, say, it's been 3-4 hours since you've eaten, your blood glucose is going to start to drop. And that's going to cause the pancreas to release a different hormone in response to hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is low blood glucose levels, and that hormone is called glucagon. And glucagon has opposite effects from insulin. It causes the liver to break down glucose stores, and it causes the fat to break down to give alternate sources of energy. And that's going to return your blood glucose levels to normal. So throughout the day, you alternate which of these hormones you're producing. If you've just eaten, you're making insulin. If you haven't eaten for a while, you'll be making glucagon. So they fluctuate throughout the day to keep your blood glucose levels within normal range. In diabetes is where you have inadequate either production or response to insulin, and so your blood glucose levels go abnormally high because you're not able to get that glucose out of the blood and into the cells. So it's kind of ironic that the cells think they're starving because they're not getting glucose to use for energy, but at the same time your blood glucose levels are very high. The final group of hormones we're going to talk about are the hormones produced by the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland sits on top of your kidney. It's kind of like a little wedge-shaped hormone on top of gland on top of your kidney. And it produces a number of hormones related to control of stress, both short-term stress and long-term stress. The first one I'm going to mention is called excuse me, cortisol. And cortisol release is controlled by the pituitary gland, by one of those stimulating hormones, ACTH, causes the adrenal gland to release cortisol. And cortisol kind of prepares, causes breakdown of fat and proteins to increase energy sources in the blood in response to stress. And it also can affect blood pressure and some other activities. So this is more released in long-term stress. It's not short-term stress. So this is more long-term stress, which could be like if you're ill for a while, if you have a long-term infection, then you would be releasing cortisol in response to stress. So these are the long-term effects of, they don't call it cortisol as much anymore. They call it glucocorticoid. Don't ask me why. So that's controlled by the adrenal gland, the pituitary gland stimulates the adrenal gland to produce the glucocorticoids, which again is cortisol. and that causes breakdown of proteins and fat. Also inhibits the inflammatory response. So that's why cortisol is sometimes used as an anti-inflammatory agent, has lots of other serious effects. So it's only used when non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents don't work. So the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents are things like Tylenol and acetaminophen and ibuprofen. Cortisol is a steroidal anti-inflammatory agent, but it also has the effect of decreasing inflammation and inhibiting their immune response. The other stress hormone produced by the adrenal gland is produced by the inner part of the adrenal gland, and it's epinephrine. And epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. They've changed the name of adrenaline to epinephrine, but it was originally named adrenaline because they knew it was produced by the adrenal gland, but it's also produced by the brain. And that's one of the reasons they changed the name. And that's more the short-term response to stress. That's like the fight or flight, where, you know, your heart starts racing, your blood pressure increases, your blood glucose levels go up, your muscles get ready to move. So that's like when something scares you or someone comes up behind you and scares you. That's the epinephrine response to stress. So that's more the short term, whereas the cortisol is the long-term response to stress. An EpiPen, which some people that have asthma or severe allergies have an EpiPen contains epinephrine. And the reason that works for severe allergy responses is that it's a bronchodilator. And so if you're having constriction of the bronchial tubes due to asthma or severe allergy, the epinephrine will relax those bronchial tubes. The reason it does that is if you're doing this fight or flight response, you have to get more oxygen, and so you're able to breathe better. And so that's why it's used to control, to alleviate those asthma attacks, etc. Okay, we're going to stop here. We still have reproductive hormones, which is going to be the final PowerPoint that we'll cover next, but that's the end of this one. And bye-bye.